Welcome back to the Takeout. Let's get you caught up if you're just joining us. Today, Iran fired about a dozen short and medium-range missiles at an American military base in Qatar in retaliation for U.S. airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities over the weekend. American officials have described the Iranian response as expected and calibrated. So far, there are no reports of American casualties. Here now is more of my conversation with retired Marine General Frank McKenzie. And just to kind of pick up on the number of missiles and kind of how I think a lot of people might look at this and say, wait, deploying missiles is a de-escalation. Can you kind of describe the scope of and the severity of what we've seen today? Kind of put that in context for us.
So Iran probably has 1,000 to 2,000 missiles that could target our bases in the Gulf region. They have 1,000 missiles probably that can target Tel Aviv. But for various reasons, they can only launch about 200 at a time at Israel. They could launch, because these are longer range missiles that require more preparation for launching. These shorter range missiles, which are probably what we saw in this latest attack, require less preparation, and therefore they can fire far more of them in a salvo. Had they chosen to launch a salvo of several hundred missiles, that would have been a very clear signal. Instead, they chose to launch a salvo of what appears to be less than 10 missiles. That is signaling of the most obvious nature.
Okay, interesting. Another option that they have that doesn't involve strikes is potentially closing the Strait of Hormuz, of course, this critical waterway for oil. How likely do you think that that actually is?
So we will know if they make preparations to do that. We monitor that pretty closely. Iran has a lot of very good mines. They have pressure mines, contact mines, influence mines, all kinds of mines. They could choose to close the Strait of Hormuz. If they did, we would eventually be able to reopen it. The reopening would not be immediate. It would take time. But we've done this before. It would also probably involve the destruction of the Iranian Navy. So there would be a price to be paid by Iran for doing this, should they choose to do it. But yes, they could choose to inflict that level of pain on the world commerce.
And would that be taken as an escalation of sorts?
Well, it would be an act of war to do that. And so, yes, I think it would be clearly seen as an escalation, although, Caitlin, the fact of the matter is not a lot of U.S. commerce goes through the Strait of Hormuz. It actually affects China and other nations like that far more than us. So other nations would pay that price far more than the United States if the Strait of Hormuz were closed. But also the fact of the matter is we participate in world commerce, so it would eventually affect us, but not directly. So other nations should be very concerned should Iran choose to close the strait through mining.
You are no longer serving, you're retired, but you did. If I can kind of ask you to put that hat back on for a moment, and I know you can't get inside the president's mind, but can you help us understand how a president, especially this president, arrives at the conclusion to make this kind of decision? You mentioned that he's presented with an array of options, but this is a president who campaigned for the past decade of not entering the U.S. into broader conflicts, and that is a core part of his message and something that the base of his party has been really pressuring him on. Can you kind of just take us inside what his mindset might be like if you were there counseling him, as you have in the past, how he arrived at this particular decision?
Sure. So I would tell you two things. First of all, you hit on it. The job of the military is to give options to the president. Big options, small options, options in between. And so you would be focused on that as the military person giving advice. The second thing is, a key part of what he also campaigned on was Iran not having a nuclear weapon. He's made no secret of that going back from the very beginning of his time in presidential politics. So I am not surprised that he made this decision now. And I think it is not actually inconsistent with his other approach to problems. I do also agree with you, he's not interested in a major war with Iran. And if Iran is smart, they won't test that hypothesis.
Well, it's interesting, too, because the message was over the weekend, this is one and done. This is a limited strike, a very specific strike. But I'm wondering, in your view, is that possible? Is it possible to have kind of a one and done approach here?
It is, if we were able to ensure that the Iranian attacks have not caused any U.S. casualties. Then I think a lot of options are on the table. If the Iranians persist in striking us, then eventually probably something bad's going to happen and we're going to respond. And it will be a significant response, I believe, if that happens.
And then just looking forward, how can the U.S. define a measure of success here? And what would we expect to see from the Iranians to get to that point?
I think you need a policy decision from Iran to cease militarization of its nuclear program. Now, they would argue they're not militarizing, but in fact, there are military components to it. I think we need to see something demonstrable, verifiable, with strict watchdog procedures. I am neutral as to whether or not they have a nuclear program. That's not a military question particularly. But if they do have a nuclear program, it would need to be carefully monitored. They certainly don't need to refine to 60%. So there are a lot of things that we could do there that would give Iran a path forward. But I think the best of all solutions here would be an Iranian policy decision about that. That would open a lot of doors to Iran. It might eventually lead to them being, coming back into the family of nations, if you will, because they're certainly a pariah state now.
Right, and to that point, I mean, you mentioned a little bit about what this says about their military capability. I think what is so striking, for lack of a better word, about what we saw over the weekend was how precise the U.S. military was and how successful under those terms they were. It appears that Iran, of course, is no match for that kind of military might. But what should we know about the capability of the Iranian military to be able to respond if negotiation is not ultimately on the card?
So really all they have left are their residual ICBM forces, or IRBM force, intermediate range and short range ballistic missiles. As I've noted, they probably have 2,000 to 3,000 of those missiles left. They have throughput problems in launching them at long ranges, as we've discussed. But they have those. They have drones and they have land attack cruise missiles. Really, that's what they've got. They don't have an air force, particularly. Their Navy is not insignificant, but it would not take long for us to destroy it, should we choose to do so. So Iran has very limited options. Plus, their air defense system has been attrited to the point where I have no reason to not believe what the chairman said the other day, that they didn't shoot it all at us as we struck their most precious targets. And so that's very telling about the level of degradation that Iran has experienced. They're in trouble. They're in bad shape right now. And the regime is probably under more pressure than it's been under in many decades.
General McKenzie, we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kayla.